Have you ever stood in a room full of people who believed you were a monster? Have you ever felt the weight of 1,000 eyes judging you, condemning you, certain of your guilt before you even opened your mouth to defend yourself? I have. And let me tell you, it's a special kind of hell that words can barely capture. My name doesn't matter anymore. What matters is what happened to me, what was done to me, and how one single piece of paper saved my entire life from being destroyed by the most elaborate and cruel lie I could have ever imagined. This is my story, and I'm sharing it because I need you to understand that sometimes the people closest to you, the ones you trust with your heart and soul, can become the very architects of your destruction. I never thought I'd be standing in a courtroom, fighting for my freedom, my reputation, my very existence. But that's exactly where I found myself on a cold Tuesday morning in October. The courtroom smelled of old wood and anxiety, that particular scent that seems to permeate every building where justice is supposed to be served but sometimes fails. Every creak of the wooden benches, every whisper from the gallery behind me, every shuffle of papers felt like a nail being driven into my coffin. I sat there in my ill-fitting suit, borrowed from a friend because I'd lost everything by that point. Even my good clothes had been locked away in the house I could no longer enter, and I watched as my former wife, the woman I'd loved for 12 years, sat across the aisle with tears streaming down her perfectly made-up face, playing the victim so convincingly that I almost believed her myself. Almost. You see, Sarah had accused me of things so terrible, so unforgivable, that even my own mother had stopped taking my calls. My mother, who had raised me to be gentle and kind, who had taught me to respect women, who had been so proud when I became a teacher because she said I had a gift for caring about others. Even she had doubts. That's what false accusations do. They don't just attack you. They poison every relationship you have, every memory you've built, every foundation you thought was solid. Sarah had woven a tale of financial abuse, emotional manipulation, and threats that painted me as a controlling, dangerous man who had systematically destroyed her spirit over years of marriage. She had witnesses lined up like soldiers ready for battle. She had text messages that seemed to document her fear and pain. She had journal entries that chronicled my alleged reign of terror in painful detail. She had everything a prosecutor could want, every piece of evidence carefully arranged to tell a story of victimhood and abuse. And I had nothing but my word, which in that courtroom, with all those eyes staring at me with suspicion and disgust, meant absolutely nothing at all. The prosecutor was a sharp woman in her 50s named Diane Hartwell, and she was very, very good at her job. Too good, perhaps. She stood before the jury with the confidence of someone who knew she'd already won, someone who had seen cases like this 100 times and knew exactly how they ended. She laid out the case against me with surgical precision, her voice steady and authoritative, painting me as a predator who had hidden behind a mask of kindness while secretly tormenting the woman I'd promised to love and protect. Every piece of evidence she presented felt damning. Every witness testimony felt like another shovelful of dirt on my grave. I remember sitting there, my hands trembling beneath the defense table where the jury couldn't see them, feeling my attorney's hand on my arm. A gesture meant to be reassuring, but that only reminded me how utterly powerless I was in that moment. The trembling wasn't just fear. It was rage mixed with despair, the kind of emotion that sits in your chest like a stone and makes it hard to breathe. My attorney, Marcus Reed, was an older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes that had seen too much injustice in his 40 years of practice. He'd taken my case when no one else would, not because I could pay him. I couldn't. I'd already spent what little savings I had on the first 3 attorneys who'd turned me away, but because something in my story had resonated with him. "I believe you," he'd said during our first meeting in that cramped office that smelled of coffee and old books. "And I'm going to prove it." Those words, those simple, powerful words, were the first kindness anyone had shown me in months, and I'm not ashamed to admit I broke down crying right there in his office, sobbing like a child while this dignified man handed me tissues and waited patiently for me to compose myself. But as I sat there in that courtroom watching my life being dismantled piece by piece, listening to Sarah describe a version of our marriage that bore no resemblance to reality, I wondered if even Marcus's belief would be enough to save me. The story of how I got to that courtroom begins 3 years earlier, in what I thought was the happiest period of my life. Sarah and I had just celebrated our 9th wedding anniversary with a trip to Mexico, where we'd renewed our vows on a beach at sunset. I can still remember how the sand felt beneath my bare feet, how the ocean breeze carried the scent of salt and possibility, How Sarah had looked at me with what I believed was genuine love in her eyes as we repeated our promises to each other. We were surrounded by friends and family who'd made the trip with us, and I remember thinking that I was the luckiest man alive. She was beautiful, intelligent, successful in her own right as a marketing executive at a prestigious firm downtown, and she'd chosen me. Me, a middle school history teacher with a modest salary, a small apartment, and big dreams of one day writing a book about the Civil War that probably would never get published. I wasn't rich. I wasn't particularly handsome. I was just a guy who loved teaching kids about the past and hoped to make a difference in their lives. But somehow I'd won the heart of this incredible woman, and I thanked God for it every single day. We'd met at a bookstore 7 years before that anniversary, both reaching for the same biography of Eleanor Roosevelt at exactly the same moment. Our hands touched, and when our eyes met, I felt something I'd only read about in novels, that instant connection, that sense of recognition, like meeting someone you've known forever. It sounds like something out of a romance novel, I know, and I used to be embarrassed to tell the story because it seemed too perfect, too convenient. But that's genuinely how it happened. We laughed about the coincidence, and I offered to let her take the book, but she suggested we grab coffee instead and talk about why we were both interested in Eleanor Roosevelt. 3 hours later, we were still talking, the coffee shop staff giving us pointed looks as they started stacking chairs around us. 6 months after that, I proposed to her in that same bookstore, in front of that same Eleanor Roosevelt biography shelf, with the same staff watching and applauding when she said yes. Our marriage wasn't perfect, whose is, but I thought it was solid, built on a foundation of friendship and mutual respect that would weather any storm. We had our arguments, sure. Money was sometimes tight, especially on a teacher's salary in an expensive city where rent alone consumed most of my paycheck. Sarah wanted to travel more, buy a bigger house in a better neighborhood, have nicer things, wear designer clothes, and sometimes I felt the crushing pressure of not being able to provide everything she wanted. I could see the disappointment in her eyes when her friends talked about their husbands' successes, their big houses, their expensive vacations. But I loved her. God, I loved her so much it physically hurt sometimes. I worked extra jobs during the summer break, teaching summer school and tutoring students whose parents could afford to pay. I took on weekend tutoring sessions, sacrificing my free time to earn extra money. I did everything I could to make her happy, to give her the life she deserved, to be worthy of the choice she'd made when she married me. We'd talked extensively about having children, and while Sarah had seemed hesitant at first, citing her career, her desire to travel, the expense of raising kids, I thought we were slowly moving toward that dream together. I'd catch her looking at baby clothes in store windows, see her pause when we passed playgrounds full of laughing children, and I'd feel hopeful that maybe soon we'd start our own family. I was so blind. Looking back now with the clarity that comes from betrayal and hindsight, I can see all the signs I missed, all the red flags I ignored because I was too in love, too trusting, too naive to imagine that the woman I'd chosen to spend my life with could be capable of such calculated cruelty. The way she'd started staying late at work more and more frequently, coming home after 10 or 11 at night, claiming big projects and demanding clients. The new password on her phone that she'd changed without explanation, holding the device away from me when notifications came through. The emotional distance that crept into her eyes when she looked at me, like she was seeing a stranger instead of her husband. The way she'd pull away when I tried to hold her at night, claiming she was too tired or too stressed for intimacy. The separate checking account she'd mentioned casually, saying it was just for her personal expenses, and that lots of married couples had separate accounts. But I chalked it all up to stress at work, to the normal ebbs and flows of a long-term relationship, to the challenges every couple faces. I never imagined, not even in my darkest, most insecure moments, what she was actually planning. I never dreamed that while I was working extra hours to save for our future, she was systematically destroying any chance we had at one. The manipulation started so gradually that I didn't even notice it happening. It started small, with little comments dropped into conversations with our friends. She'd say things like, "Oh, I have to check with the accountant before I can buy that," laughing but with an edge in her voice, gesturing at me like I was some kind of financial tyrant. She'd tell people, half joking but with enough seriousness to make them uncomfortable, that I monitored her spending, that I needed to approve her purchases, that she felt like she had to ask permission to buy herself nice things. The truth was completely different. The truth was that we had a shared budget because we were trying desperately to save for a down payment on a house, something Sarah had said she wanted more than anything. The truth was that I'd simply asked her to let me know about large purchases so we could plan together and make sure we didn't overdraw our account or derail our savings goals. It was a normal, reasonable request that any financial advisor would recommend for couples sharing finances. But Sarah twisted it, carefully and methodically, made it sound sinister and controlling, made me sound like a tyrant who controlled every dollar she spent, every choice she made. She planted seeds of doubt in every mind she could reach, creating a narrative that would eventually serve her purposes perfectly. Then came the text messages, and this is where her planning became truly diabolical. She started texting our friends, her family members, even her coworkers, with carefully crafted messages that hinted at trouble at home without ever saying anything specific enough to be challenged or verified. "I don't know how much longer I can do this," one text read, sent to her sister at 2 a.m. when she knew I was asleep. "I'm scared," said another, sent to her best friend with no context, no explanation, just those 2 words designed to create concern and suspicion. "Things are getting worse," she told her mother. "I feel trapped," she confided to a coworker. When her sister called me, her voice tight with concern and barely concealed accusation, I was genuinely confused. "Scared of what?" I'd asked, my heart racing because I couldn't imagine what Sarah might be afraid of in our quiet, boring, ordinary life. "Sarah won't tell me the details," her sister had said, and I could hear the judgment in her voice, the assumption that I already knew what I'd done and was playing dumb. "But she says things are bad between you two. She says you've changed. She says she doesn't recognize you anymore." I tried to talk to Sarah about it that night when she got home from work, sitting her down at our kitchen table and asking her gently what was wrong, what I'd done, how I could fix it. But she became defensive immediately, her face flushing with what I mistook for embarrassment, but now recognize as anger at being confronted. She accused me of attacking her, of not trusting her, of trying to control even her relationships with her own family. Before I could respond or try to understand what was happening, she stormed out of the kitchen and locked herself in our bedroom. I slept on the couch that night, bewildered and hurt, staring at the ceiling and running through every interaction we'd had recently, trying to figure out what I'd done wrong, how I'd failed her, why the woman I loved seemed to hate me suddenly. This pattern continued and escalated over the following months, and I was too confused and too desperate to fix things to see it for what it was. Sarah was building a narrative, constructing a careful, detailed story of abuse and control that existed only in carefully crafted text messages, staged conversations, and manufactured incidents. She was creating a paper trail, documenting a history of victimhood that would later seem compelling and credible because she'd been so methodical about it. She'd pick fights over nothing, then text her friends immediately afterward describing a completely different version of events where I was the aggressor, the one yelling, the one being unreasonable. She'd refuse intimacy and then tell her therapist, a therapist I didn't even know she was seeing, that I made her feel unsafe and unwanted. Every action she took, every word she spoke was calculated to serve a purpose I couldn't see, because I still believed we were partners, still believed we were going to work through whatever rough patch we were experiencing. Then came the day everything exploded, the day my entire world came crashing down around me. I came home from work on a regular Wednesday afternoon in March, tired from a long day of teaching 8th graders about the Louisiana Purchase and dealing with the usual chaos of middle school education. I was looking forward to a quiet evening at home, maybe ordering pizza, watching a movie with Sarah if she wasn't working late again, just being together. Instead, I found 2 police officers waiting for me in my driveway, their patrol car parked where I usually parked my own car. My first thought was that something had happened to Sarah, that there'd been an accident or an emergency, and my heart started racing with fear for her safety. But then I saw their faces, saw the way they were looking at me, not with sympathy but with disgust and suspicion, and I knew something was very, very wrong. Sarah had filed for a restraining order. The words didn't make sense at first when they told me. A restraining order? Against me? Why would Sarah need protection from me? I'd never hurt her, never threatened her, never even raised my voice to her in anger. But the officers didn't want to hear my confusion or my protests. They had paperwork, official documents with legal seals and signatures. Sarah claimed I'd threatened her life. She said she feared for her safety. She said she needed immediate protection from me, her own husband, the man who'd promised to protect her always. I was served with papers right there in my driveway, in front of my neighbors who had come out of their houses to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity, shock, and judgment. The restraining order was comprehensive and devastating. I wasn't allowed back in my own house, not even to collect my belongings. I couldn't come within 500 feet of Sarah at all times. I couldn't call her, text her, email her, or contact her in any way. I couldn't go to the grocery store we usually shopped at, the gym where we both had memberships, the coffee shop where we'd first fallen in love. Entire sections of my own city were suddenly off limits to me because Sarah might be there. My principal called me that evening, her voice strained and uncomfortable, and suggested, though it was clearly not a suggestion, that I take a leave of absence while things got sorted out. The school board couldn't have a teacher under investigation for domestic violence working with children, you understand? It was a liability issue. It didn't matter that I'd been teaching there for 8 years with a spotless record, that parents requested me specifically for their children, that I'd won Teacher of the Year 2 years running. None of that mattered anymore because I'd been accused, and in today's world, accusation is often indistinguishable from guilt. My salary stopped immediately. My reputation crumbled overnight. Friends I'd known for years stopped calling and stopped responding to my desperate messages. Family members asked careful, probing questions that revealed they believed Sarah's version of events more than mine. My brother sent me an email saying he needed to protect his family and asking me not to contact them until this was resolved, as if I were some kind of danger to my own nieces and nephews. Within a single week, I went from having a stable life, a job I loved, a home, a wife, a place in my community, to staying on a friend's couch, unemployed, under investigation for crimes I didn't commit, and facing criminal charges based on allegations I couldn't even begin to understand because they were so utterly, completely, devastatingly false. The isolation was suffocating in a way I'd never experienced before. You don't realize how much your identity is tied to other people's perceptions until those perceptions shift, and suddenly you're a stranger, an outcast, someone to be feared and avoided. I'd go to the grocery store and see people I knew crossing to the other aisle pretending they hadn't seen me. I'd receive text messages from former friends telling me they couldn't associate with me anymore, that they had to believe Sarah, that they hoped I'd get help. My own mother called me crying, asking me how she'd failed as a parent, asking me if I'd really done the things Sarah claimed. "I raised you better than this," she said through tears, and those words hurt more than any accusation in any legal document ever could. The emotional weight of being falsely accused is something I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy, not even on Sarah despite everything she did to me. Every morning I'd wake up on that uncomfortable couch in my friend's apartment, and for a split second I'd forget. Then reality would come crashing back like a physical blow, and I'd feel physically sick, my stomach churning with anxiety and fear. The panic attack started then. Sudden, overwhelming waves of terror that would leave me gasping for breath, my heart racing, convinced I was dying. I couldn't eat because food tasted like ash in my mouth. I couldn't sleep because every time I closed my eyes I saw the jury convicting me, saw myself being led away in handcuffs, saw my entire future disappearing. I lost 25 pounds in 6 weeks, my clothes hanging off my frame, my face becoming gaunt and hollow. I looked in the mirror and didn't recognize myself, hollow-eyed, haunted, defeated. But the worst part wasn't the physical toll, as terrible as that was. The worst part was the doubt that started creeping into my own mind, insidious and poisonous. When everyone around you believes you're guilty, when every person you trusted seems convinced you're a monster, you start to question your own sanity, your own memories, your own truth. Had I done something? Was there some behavior I couldn't remember? Had I hurt her without realizing it? Had I been controlling without knowing it? Maybe I was the monster they all thought I was. I knew logically that I hadn't done what Sarah claimed. I knew I'd never threatened her, never hurt her, never tried to control her. But the human mind is fragile, and constant accusation can make you doubt even your own memories and intentions. It's a special kind of torture. This self-doubt, this wondering if maybe everyone else is right and you're the one who's wrong. Have you ever questioned your own reality like that? Have you ever been in a situation where everyone believed something about you that you knew wasn't true, but their belief was so strong that you started to wonder? I hope you never experience it because it nearly broke me completely. It was during this darkest period when I was seriously considering just giving up, just pleading guilty to something I didn't do just to make it all stop, that I met Marcus Reed. A former colleague from my teaching days, one of the few who still believed in me, recommended him. "If anyone can help you, it's Marcus," she said. "He doesn't lose. More importantly, he believes in truth, not just winning." I scraped together what little money I had left, borrowed more from the friend who'd taken me in, and went to Marcus's office expecting the same thinly veiled skepticism I'd encountered from every other attorney I'd consulted. The first 3 lawyers I'd spoken to had been polite but distant, clearly uncomfortable with my case, clearly already half convinced of my guilt. One had actually told me I should consider taking a plea deal, admitting to some lesser charge, because fighting accusations like Sarah's was nearly impossible. But Marcus was different from the moment I walked into his office. He was an older gentleman, probably in his mid-60s, with silver hair that was still thick and swept back from his forehead. He had kind blue eyes that crinkled at the corners, the eyes of someone who smiled often despite seeing too much injustice in his career. His office was cluttered with case files and law books, and there was a photo on his desk of what I assumed was his family, a wife and 2 grown daughters, all smiling at the camera. He stood up when I entered, shook my hand firmly, and invited me to sit down in a comfortable chair across from his desk. Then he did something no other lawyer had done. He listened. For 2 solid hours, he listened to my story without interrupting, without checking his phone, without glancing at his watch. He took detailed notes in a leather notebook, occasionally nodding, occasionally asking a clarifying question, but mostly just letting me talk. I told him everything, about meeting Sarah, about our marriage, about the gradual changes in her behavior, about the accusations, about losing everything. When I finished, emotionally exhausted and certain he was about to tell me there was nothing he could do, that the case was too difficult, that I should take that plea deal, he looked at me with those piercing blue eyes and said something that changed everything. "She's lying," he said simply. "I don't know why yet, and I don't know exactly how we're going to prove it, but she's lying. Every instinct I have, every pattern I've seen in 40 years of practicing law, tells me this is a manufactured case, and we're going to prove it. We're going to get you your life back." Those words, "I believe you," were the first real kindness anyone had shown me in months, and I'm not ashamed to admit I broke down crying right there in his office. I sobbed like a child, years of stress and fear and loneliness pouring out of me in great heaving gasps, while this dignified, professional man handed me tissues and waited patiently for me to compose myself. When I finally stopped crying, embarrassed and exhausted, Marcus smiled gently and said, "Don't apologize for showing emotion. What's been done to you is cruel and wrong, and anger and grief are appropriate responses. Now let's channel those emotions into something productive. Let's fight back." Marcus became more than my attorney over the following months. He became the only person in my corner, the only one fighting for my innocence when the entire world seemed aligned against me. He explained that cases like mine were becoming increasingly common, that false accusations in custody and divorce proceedings were a real and growing problem, and that the legal system was often ill-equipped to handle them fairly. "The problem," he explained during one of our many meetings, "is that we live in a time where accusation is often treated as fact, especially in cases involving alleged abuse. The pendulum has swung so far in one direction, which was necessary and important for real victims, that sometimes innocent people get caught in the machinery. The burden of proof has shifted, at least in the court of public opinion. You're guilty until proven innocent, and proving innocence is almost impossible because how do you prove something didn't happen? How do you prove the absence of abuse? How do you prove a negative?" It was a sobering reality, one that made me understand just how difficult the fight ahead would be. But Marcus had a plan, and more importantly, he had experience with cases like mine. We started investigating immediately. He hired a private investigator, a former police detective named Sarah who'd left the force after becoming disillusioned with how domestic violence cases were handled. She was thorough, professional, and determined to find the truth. We looked into Sarah's activities, her finances, her communications, her relationships. We subpoenaed phone records and bank statements. We interviewed anyone who might have information. And slowly, gradually, a picture began to emerge that was shocking even to me, even though I knew Sarah had lied. What we discovered was that Sarah hadn't just lied impulsively or out of fear or confusion. She had been planning this, methodically and carefully, for over a year. Every move had been calculated. Every piece of evidence had been manufactured with deliberate intent. Sarah had opened separate bank accounts I didn't know about, accounts in her name only at banks I'd never been to. She'd been transferring money from our joint savings into these hidden accounts, slowly draining our resources while simultaneously making it appear that I was the one controlling the finances. Small amounts at first, $200 here, $500 there. Nothing that would trigger immediate suspicion, but amounts that added up over time. She'd been having an affair with a coworker, a man named Derek who worked in her office as a senior account manager. I'd actually met Derek several times at company parties and events. He seemed nice enough, friendly and outgoing, and I'd never suspected a thing. They'd been together for at least 18 months according to the digital trail they'd left behind. And their relationship wasn't just romantic, it was conspiratorial. Text messages between them, recovered through the subpoena process, revealed the truth in stark, horrifying detail. This entire accusation was a calculated plan to divorce me, take everything we'd built together and start a new life with Derek without having to split assets or face any financial consequences. The messages were damning and chilling in their casualness. "Once the restraining order goes through, we can move forward with our plans," one message from Sarah read. "He won't be able to fight back if he's facing criminal charges," another said. "My lawyer says if the domestic violence case sticks, I get everything. The house, the savings, maybe even part of his pension." She'd written to Derek. "This will all be over soon, and then we can finally be together without hiding." Derek had replied. They'd planned it all like a military operation. The fake texts she'd sent to friends, timed carefully to create a pattern of escalating fear. The staged incidents she'd described to her therapist, none of which had actually happened. The false journal entries documenting abuse that never occurred, written all at once but backdated to make it appear she'd been keeping a record for months. Every piece of evidence she'd presented to the court was manufactured, carefully crafted over months of preparation. She and Derek had researched how to make accusations stick, what evidence would be most compelling to prosecutors and judges, how to manipulate the system to their advantage. They'd even practiced her testimony, with Derek playing the role of prosecutor and coaching Sarah on how to cry at the right moments, how to appear vulnerable and afraid, how to tell her lies in a way that would be believed. It was calculated, cruel, and absolutely devastating to discover. But knowing the truth and proving it in court were two very different things, as Marcus explained to me repeatedly. The problem was that Sarah's evidence, manufactured though it was, looked compelling on the surface. Her text messages to friends appeared genuine because they were genuine texts, just based on lies. Her journal seemed authentic because it was a real journal with real handwriting, just containing false information. Her tears in court were convincing because she'd practiced them. And under the legal system's rules of evidence and procedure, we couldn't just burst into court and say, "She's lying," because we found texts proving she's lying. We had to navigate complex legal procedures, deal with objections from Sarah's attorney, overcome the natural sympathy the court had for an alleged victim, and build a case that was airtight and undeniable. Marcus spent months preparing our defense, working 12 and 14-hour days, often well into the night. He interviewed everyone who knew us, tracking down mutual friends, former neighbors, colleagues from my school. He subpoenaed financial records from multiple banks. He hired forensic experts to analyze Sarah's journal and determine when the entries were actually written versus when they were dated. He built a timeline that showed inconsistencies in Sarah's story, moments where her allegations didn't match up with documented facts. But even with all this preparation, all these hours of work, all this evidence, Marcus told me the case would ultimately come down to one crucial moment, one piece of evidence that would either vindicate me completely or see me convicted of crimes I didn't commit. "There's a document," Marcus told me one evening as we reviewed the case for what felt like the 100th time, sitting in his office long after his secretary had gone home. "One specific piece of paper that will prove everything. It's a bank record that shows the truth behind Sarah's financial accusations and, more importantly, reveals the timeline of her planning. But I can't request it too early in the trial. If I do, they'll have time to prepare an explanation, to spin it, to make it seem like something other than what it is. Sarah's attorney is good, and she'll find a way to muddy the waters if she has advance warning. I have to wait for exactly the right moment in the trial, when Sarah has committed to her story so completely that this document will expose every lie at once, when she's trapped by her own testimony. I trusted Marcus, but the waiting was torture. Every day that passed felt like a year. The trial date approached, and I felt like I was walking toward my own execution. Sarah's attorney had painted such a vivid, detailed picture of me as an abuser that even I almost believed it sometimes. The prosecutor, Diane Hartwell, had witnesses lined up like ammunition in a gun, friends of Sarah's who would testify to her emotional state and the changes they'd noticed in her, co-workers who would say they'd observed her becoming increasingly withdrawn and fearful, even a therapist who would discuss the trauma Sarah had allegedly suffered and the symptoms she'd displayed in their sessions. How do you fight against that? How do you prove you're innocent when everyone seems so certain of your guilt? How do you overcome the basic human instinct to believe someone who claims to be a victim? The night before the trial began, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake in the small apartment I'd managed to rent with borrowed money, staring at the ceiling, watching shadows move across it as cars passed outside. I replayed every moment of my marriage, trying to understand how the woman I'd loved could do this to me. Was it just about money? Was it about Derek? Was she capable of this level of cruelty from the beginning? Or had something changed her? Or had I never really known her at all? I thought about the vows we'd taken on that beach in Mexico, the promises we'd made. In sickness and in health, for better or worse, till death do us part. I'd meant those words with every fiber of my being, had believed them with all my heart. Apparently, she hadn't. Apparently, they'd been just words to her, empty sounds made for the benefit of an audience. The first days of the trial were brutal beyond anything I'd imagined. Sarah took the stand on the second day, and she delivered a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She described years of alleged emotional abuse, painting a picture of a marriage where she'd been slowly, systematically broken down by a man who appeared kind and gentle on the outside, but was cruel and controlling behind closed doors. She talked about how I supposedly monitored her every move, questioned every purchase, made her account for every minute of her time. She described incidents that never happened, times I'd allegedly threatened her, moments where I'd supposedly intimidated her into compliance, occasions where I'd used my physical presence to make her feel unsafe. She cried at all the right moments, her voice breaking with emotion as she recounted the trauma she claimed to have endured. She painted a picture of herself as someone who'd been trapped, someone who'd loved me and tried to make the marriage work, but who'd finally reached a breaking point where she feared for her very life. I watched the jury's faces as she testified, and I saw belief, sympathy, anger directed at me. Several jury members were wiping away tears. One woman was glaring at me with open hostility. This was the power of a well-told lie, the danger of false accusations presented convincingly. Her friends testified next, and they corroborated her story with their own observations and the text messages she'd sent them. Jessica, Sarah's best friend since college, took the stand and talked about how worried she'd been, how she'd noticed changes in Sarah's behavior, how Sarah had confided in her about the alleged abuse. She seemed afraid, Jessica testified. She would jump at loud noises. She stopped making eye contact. She was always apologizing for things that weren't her fault. Mark, a colleague from Sarah's office, testified about a time he'd allegedly seen bruises on Sarah's arms. She said she'd bumped into a door, he said, but I knew that wasn't true. I could see the fear in her eyes. Except there had been no bruises, and there had been no fear. It was all manufactured, all part of the careful narrative Sarah had constructed. Each testimony felt like another nail in my coffin, another piece of evidence that seemed to prove I was exactly the monster they believed I was. Marcus cross-examined each witness carefully, methodically poking small holes in their stories. He pointed out inconsistencies in dates and times. He highlighted the fact that none of them had actually witnessed any abuse directly, that everything they knew came from what Sarah had told them. He questioned whether someone can really determine the cause of another person's alleged bruises just by looking at them. He asked if it was possible that they were interpreting Sarah's behavior through a lens she'd created, seeing what she'd told them to see rather than what was actually there. But I could tell the jury wasn't fully convinced by Marcus's cross-examination. They wanted to believe Sarah. They needed to believe her, because to do otherwise would mean accepting that someone could lie about something so serious, and that's a difficult reality to face. Then came our turn to present our defense, and Marcus began the long, difficult process of trying to prove my innocence. He called character witnesses, fellow teachers who testified about my patience and kindness, former students who talked about how I'd helped them through difficult times, neighbors who said they'd never seen or heard anything that suggested domestic violence in our home. He presented evidence of the affair, showing that Sarah had been unfaithful and had motive to lie. to create a narrative that would let her leave the marriage without facing social or financial consequences. He showed financial records demonstrating that Sarah had been the one secretly moving money, opening hidden accounts, preparing for a future that didn't include me. He presented expert testimony about how journal entries could be backdated, how someone could create a false documentary record of abuse that never occurred. But Sarah's attorney, a woman named Patricia Coleman, who was just as skilled as Marcus, was ready for every piece of evidence we presented. She had explanations for everything. The affair? That was a result of Sarah seeking comfort and support from someone who understood her pain, a natural consequence of the abuse she'd suffered. The financial moves? Those were Sarah trying to protect herself, trying to create a safety net so she could eventually escape the controlling relationship. The question about the journal's authenticity? There was no definitive proof it had been backdated, and Sarah's therapist testified that keeping such a journal was a common therapeutic technique for trauma processing. Every explanation Patricia offered sounded plausible. Every rebuttal seemed reasonable, and I could see the jury wavering, unsure of what to believe, trying to weigh two competing narratives that couldn't both be true. The trial lasted 4 agonizing days, and by the 4th day I was exhausted, defeated, ready for it to be over even if it meant conviction. But Marcus wasn't done. He had been waiting for exactly the right moment, and on that 4th day, when Sarah was back on the stand for additional questioning, he finally made his move. Sarah had just finished reiterating her claims about my alleged financial abuse. She described in painful, detailed fashion how I supposedly monitored every dollar she spent, how I'd threatened her if she made purchases without my approval, how I'd made her feel like a prisoner in her own home, with no control over her own money. She was passionate, convincing, her voice strong and steady as she told her lies. Marcus stood up slowly from the defense table, and I noticed something different in his demeanor, something I hadn't seen before. He had a slight smile playing at the corners of his mouth, the kind of expression someone wears when they're holding a royal flush in poker, and they're about to lay their cards on the table. He buttoned his suit jacket, a gesture that seemed deliberate and meaningful, and approached the witness stand with measured steps. "Mrs. Harrison," he began, using her maiden name, which she'd returned to during the proceedings. "You've testified extensively about financial abuse, about how my client controlled every aspect of your spending and made all financial decisions unilaterally, correct?" "Yes," Sarah said, her voice strong and unwavering. "That's correct. He controlled everything. And this financial abuse, as you describe it, went on for years?" "Yes, for most of our marriage, from probably the 3rd or 4th year on. So it would be fair to say that during your marriage you had no financial independence whatsoever, no access to funds without my client's knowledge and approval?" "Exactly," Sarah said, leaning forward slightly as if to emphasize her point. "That's what I've been trying to tell everyone. That's what I've been living with." Marcus nodded slowly, and then he turned to address the judge. "Your Honor, at this time I'd like to request a document from First National Bank, account number 847-392-5528. I'm requesting the complete transaction history for this account for the past 3 years, including all deposits, withdrawals, and transfers." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Sarah's face, which had been flushed with the passion of her testimony, went completely pale. All the color drained from her cheeks, and I saw her hand grip the edge of the witness stand so hard her knuckles turned white. Patricia Coleman, Sarah's attorney, shot to her feet so fast her chair rolled backward. "Objection, Your Honor." Her voice was sharp, urgent. "This is the first we're hearing of this account. This is ambush tactics and—" "Your Honor," Marcus interrupted calmly, his voice measured and professional. "This account is directly relevant to the witness's testimony about financial abuse. The prosecution has opened the door to financial matters by making them a central part of their case. This document is crucial to impeaching the witness's credibility and demonstrating that her testimony is, quite simply, false." The judge, an older man named Harrison, who'd been presiding with stern professionalism throughout the trial, looked between the two attorneys for a moment. I could see him weighing the objection, considering the implications. Finally, he nodded. "I'll allow it. The witness has made extensive claims about financial control and abuse. The defense is entitled to present evidence that contradicts those claims. Bailiff, please retrieve the requested document from the court clerk." The next 15 minutes felt like hours. The courtroom, which had been filled with tension and drama throughout the trial, became almost unbearably silent. You could hear every tiny sound, the scratch of the court reporter's fingers on her machine, the rustle of paper as people shifted in their seats, the hum of the ventilation system. Patricia was furiously writing notes, probably trying to figure out what this mystery account was and how to explain it. Sarah sat on the witness stand looking like she might be sick. Her earlier confidence completely evaporated. She kept glancing at Derek, who was sitting in the gallery, and I could see the panic in both their faces. Marcus stood calmly at the defense table, reviewing his own notes, completely composed. He'd been planning this moment for weeks, waiting for exactly the right time to spring his trap, and now it was finally here. When the bailiff returned with a manila folder containing the documents and handed them to Marcus, I saw my attorney's eyes light up with something like satisfaction. He reviewed them briefly, nodded to himself, and then approached the witness stand once more. "Mrs. Harrison," he said, his voice still calm but with an edge now, a sharpness that hadn't been there before. "Do you recognize this account number?" Sarah's voice, which had been so strong moments earlier, was barely a whisper now. I'm not sure, I don't remember. Let me refresh your memory then. This is a personal checking account at First National Bank, opened in your name alone on March 15th, 2 years ago. Does that sound familiar now?" Sarah glanced desperately at her attorney, who looked equally confused and concerned. Yes, I may have opened an account. I don't see what you may have." Marcus's voice was sharp now, cutting through her deflection. "Mrs. Harrison, this account shows regular deposits totaling over $47,000 over the past 2 years. Money transferred from the joint account you shared with my client. Money you moved secretly, systematically, without his knowledge or consent. Does that help your memory?" The courtroom erupted. The gallery behind me burst into murmurs and exclamations. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order. Patricia was on her feet again, objecting strenuously, but the judge overruled her. Sarah's face had gone from pale to bright red, flushed with what I recognized as embarrassment and anger at being caught. I needed to protect myself financially," she stammered, her earlier composure completely gone. "That's what my attorney advised." "Protect yourself?" Marcus's voice rose slightly, still controlled but with more force behind it. "Mrs. Harrison, these bank records show something very interesting. They show that you made these transfers according to a very specific pattern. Small amounts, $200 here, $500 there, designed to go unnoticed, to fly under the radar of someone who supposedly controlled your every financial move. But more importantly, these records show that on November 3rd of last year, you made a cash withdrawal of $15,000, a very large withdrawal. And do you know what else happened on November 3rd? Sarah didn't answer. She just stared at Marcus with wide, frightened eyes, like a deer caught in headlights. Her mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. "Let me remind you," Marcus continued, turning to address the jury directly now. "November 3rd was the day that Mrs. Harrison claims my client threatened her physically for the first time. The day she claims was so traumatic, so terrifying, that she started keeping a journal documenting the abuse. The day that, according to her testimony, marked the beginning of the worst period of alleged abuse in their marriage. But these bank records tell a very different story, don't they?" Marcus held up the documents so the jury could see them, though they were too far away to read the details. "They show that on that very day, the day she claims to have been threatened and traumatized, Mrs. Harrison withdrew $15,000 in cash, and the withdrawal slip, which is part of this document package, shows a note written by Mrs. Harrison herself. Would you like to know what that note says?" He didn't wait for an answer. "It says, 'New Beginning Fund. New Beginning Fund. Not Escape Fund or Safety Fund or Emergency Fund. New Beginning.'" As if she was planning not to escape from abuse but to start a new life. A life she'd been carefully planning and financing for months. The jury was leaning forward now, completely engaged, hanging on every word. Some of them were looking at Sarah with expressions that had shifted from sympathy to suspicion. Marcus continued, relentless now, but it gets more interesting. "Also in this document package are ATM records showing that this $15,000 in cash was deposited the very next day into another account, an account at Community Trust Bank in the name of Derek Matthews. The same Derek Matthews who Mrs. Harrison has admitted to having a relationship with. The same Derek Matthews who is sitting in this courtroom right now. Marcus gestured toward Derek, and every head in the courtroom turned to look at him. Derek's face had gone white, and he looked like he wanted to disappear into his seat. "These records show a clear pattern," Marcus said, his voice ringing with conviction now. "On dates when Mrs. Harrison claims to have been most traumatized by my client's alleged abuse, she was making large financial transactions benefiting her affair partner. The correlation is undeniable. Every major accusation corresponds with a financial move. Every claim of escalating abuse matches with escalating transfers of marital assets. This isn't the behavior of a victim trying to survive. This is the behavior of someone executing a carefully planned fraud." The courtroom exploded again. Patricia was objecting loudly. The prosecutor was on her feet demanding to see the documents, and the gallery was buzzing with shocked conversations. Sarah had broken down on the witness stand, but these weren't the tears of trauma or victimhood she'd shown earlier. These were tears of someone whose elaborate lies had been exposed, someone who'd been caught in a trap of her own making. The judge had to bang his gavel repeatedly to restore order, his face stern. "Order! I will have order in this court." When silence finally fell, heavy and thick with tension, Marcus delivered the final devastating blow. "Your Honor, ladies and gentlemen of the jury," he said, his voice steady and clear, "these documents prove unequivocally that Mrs. Harrison was not a victim of financial abuse. She had full, unrestricted access to marital funds throughout the marriage. She systematically moved money into secret accounts while simultaneously creating a false narrative of abuse and control. The dates of the first alleged threats correspond exactly with large financial transactions benefiting her affair partner. This isn't a case of domestic violence or abuse. This is a case of premeditated fraud, defamation, and conspiracy. Mrs. Harrison manufactured evidence, manipulated friends and family who trusted her, weaponized the legal system and law enforcement, all to destroy my client's life, reputation, and freedom. And why? So she could take marital assets without consequences, leave the marriage without having to split property fairly, and start a new life with her affair partner, while my client faced criminal charges for abuse that never happened. Sarah had completely broken down now, sobbing loudly, but it was too late. Her attorney tried desperately to recover, tried to spin the evidence, tried to explain how this could somehow be consistent with abuse. But there was no explaining away bank records that showed calculated planning, no spinning transaction dates that matched perfectly with accusations, no justifying handwritten notes about new beginnings that coincided with claims of trauma. The damage was done, and everyone in that courtroom could see the truth now. The prosecutor, Diane Hartwell, looked absolutely devastated. She'd clearly believed Sarah's story, had probably taken this case because she thought she was getting justice for a real victim. Now she realized she'd been used as a weapon in a calculated scheme to destroy an innocent man's life. I actually felt sorry for her in that moment, seeing the realization dawn on her face that she'd been manipulated. Over the next 2 days, Marcus systematically dismantled every remaining piece of Sarah's case, using those bank records as the foundation. He showed how every major accusation of abuse, the alleged threats, the claims of control, the instances of supposed intimidation, corresponded with specific financial transactions. He brought in handwriting experts, who examined Sarah's journal, and confirmed that all the entries had been written in a very short period of time, probably over a weekend, not gradually over months, as she'd claimed. The ink, the pressure of the handwriting, the paper's aging, all of it pointed to recent creation, not ongoing documentation. He presented the text messages between Sarah and Derek that we'd subpoenaed, messages that referenced the plan and discussed how to make it convincing and what evidence the courts usually find most compelling. He showed how Sarah had researched divorce law, financial settlements in abuse cases, and how restraining orders worked. He demonstrated that every piece of evidence she'd presented had been carefully manufactured to serve a specific purpose in her scheme. By the time closing arguments came around, the case was effectively over. Patricia Coleman did her best, tried to argue that even if some of Sarah's story was exaggerated, there must have been some truth to the abuse claims. But it was a weak argument, and everyone knew it. The evidence of planning, of calculated deception, was overwhelming. Marcus's closing argument was powerful and moving. He talked about the presumption of innocence, about how false accusations destroy lives, about the responsibility we all have to seek truth, rather than simply believing the most compelling story. My client is an innocent man, Marcus said, his voice filled with quiet passion. He loved his wife. He worked extra jobs to try to give her the life she wanted. He never hurt her, never threatened her, never controlled her. And for his love and dedication, he was rewarded with lies, betrayal, and a calculated attempt to destroy his life. He lost his job. He lost his home. He lost his reputation. He lost relationships with friends and family, all because one person decided that his life was worth less than her convenience, that destroying him was an acceptable price to pay for avoiding an honest divorce. This cannot stand. Justice must be served, not just for my client, but for every person who has ever been falsely accused, and to send a message that the legal system cannot and will not be weaponized for personal gain. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours before returning with their verdict. I sat in the courtroom, Marcus's hand on my shoulder, barely able to breathe as the foreperson stood to read the verdict. In the case of the State versus James Harrison, on the charge of domestic violence, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of criminal threats, we find the defendant not guilty. On the charge of emotional abuse, we find the defendant not guilty. Not guilty. Not guilty on all charges. The relief that flooded through me was so intense it was almost painful. I felt like I'd been holding my breath for months and could finally exhale. Marcus was shaking my hand, pulling me into a brief embrace, congratulating me. But the judge wasn't done. He took the unusual step of addressing the court directly about what had transpired. This court has witnessed a grave miscarriage of justice that was narrowly avoided, he said, his voice stern and disapproving. The evidence presented has revealed a calculated scheme to defraud both this court and an innocent man. I am ordering an immediate investigation into Sarah Harrison and Derek Matthews for perjury, fraud, conspiracy, and obstruction of justice. Bailiff, please take Mrs. Harrison into custody pending arraignment on these charges. Sarah was arrested right there in the courtroom. The bailiff approached the witness stand where she still sat, read her rights, and placed handcuffs on her wrists while she sobbed. Derek tried to slip out of the courtroom but was stopped by police officers who'd been stationed at the doors. The restraining order against me was immediately dissolved. My name was cleared. My reputation was restored, at least legally. But I knew the real work of rebuilding my life was just beginning. I'll never forget the feeling of walking out of that courtroom, a free man, vindicated, proven innocent, beyond any doubt. Marcus walked beside me, fielding questions from reporters who'd gotten word of the dramatic reversal. Justice was served today, Marcus told them. An innocent man's life has been restored, and those who sought to destroy it will face appropriate consequences. In the weeks and months that followed, the full scope of what Sarah and Derek had done came to light through the criminal investigation. They'd planned everything for over a year. They'd researched how to make false accusations stick, what evidence would be most compelling, how to manipulate the system. Derek had actually encouraged Sarah to keep the fake journal, had helped her craft the text messages to friends, had coached her on how to cry convincingly. They'd treated my destruction like a project, complete with timelines and goals and milestones. There were spreadsheets on Derek's computer outlining the plan, including projected financial gains and a timeline for when they could start their new life together. It was chilling to read, seeing your own destruction planned out in bullet points and schedules. Sarah eventually pleaded guilty to multiple charges, including perjury, fraud, making false statements to police, and conspiracy. She was sentenced to 18 months in prison and ordered to pay full restitution for my legal fees, lost wages, and damages. It wasn't enough. No amount of punishment could truly compensate for what she'd done, but it was something. Derek lost his job when his employer learned of his involvement and faced his own criminal charges. He was sentenced to a year in prison and ordered to pay restitution as well. But beyond the legal consequences, the damage they did to me, to my career, to my relationships, to my ability to trust, that couldn't be fully repaired by a guilty verdict or a prison sentence. I did return to teaching, though it took nearly 6 months before the school board agreed to reinstate me. Even then, it was difficult. Some colleagues were warm and welcoming, apologizing for having doubted me. Others were distant, still uncomfortable, unable to quite shake the memory of the accusations even though they'd been proven false. Some parents requested that their children not be placed in my class. I understood their caution, but it hurt nonetheless. The most difficult part was rebuilding relationships with friends and family. Some people apologized profusely, ashamed that they'd doubted me. Others just pretended nothing had happened, never acknowledging that they'd abandoned me when I needed them most. My mother cried when we finally spoke, apologizing over and over for not believing me. My brother sent a long email trying to explain his position, asking for forgiveness. I forgave them both because what choice did I have? Holding on to anger would only hurt me more. But trust, once broken, is difficult to fully restore. It's been 3 years now since the trial ended, and I'm finally beginning to feel like myself again, though I'm not the same person I was before all this happened. How could I be? I've learned hard, painful lessons about trust, about how people can hide their true natures behind masks of love and commitment. I've learned how fragile reputation can be, how quickly a lifetime of good behavior can be overshadowed by accusations. I've learned how easily the legal system can be manipulated by someone determined and clever enough to exploit it. But I've also learned about resilience, about the incredible strength human beings have to survive terrible things. I've learned about the importance of having people who believe in you, people like Marcus who fight for truth and justice even when it's difficult. I've learned that while lies can be powerful and destructive, truth is ultimately more powerful if you're willing to fight for it. Marcus and I remain close. He never did charge me his full fee, saying that seeing justice served was payment enough, though I've been paying him back in installments whenever I can. He's become more than my attorney. He's become a friend and mentor. I've also become an advocate for others who've been falsely accused. I volunteer with organizations that provide support, resources, and legal assistance to people going through what I went through. I share my story at support groups and conferences, hoping it might help someone else feel less alone, might give them hope that they can survive this. I've learned that false accusations are more common than most people realize, and that they destroy lives in ways that are hard to quantify. It's not just the legal consequences, though those are devastating. It's the loss of trust, the isolation, the damage to mental health, the way it changes how you see the world and other people. Have you ever been through something that fundamentally changed how you see the world? Have you ever had your trust shattered so completely that you had to rebuild it from nothing? Have you ever been forced to question everything you believed about someone you loved? I'd love to hear your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. This story isn't just about what happened to me. It's about something bigger and more important. It's about how the system can be manipulated and weaponized against innocent people. It's about the importance of seeking truth rather than just believing the most emotionally compelling story. It's about how crucial it is to have people who will fight for you when you can't fight for yourself. Understanding these dynamics, recognizing the signs of manipulation, and knowing that false accusations do happen and can happen to anyone, these are vital lessons that could protect you or someone you love someday. I'm not sharing this story to make you distrust all accusations or doubt all victims. Real abuse happens and real victims deserve support and justice. But false accusations also happen, and innocent people deserve protection and due process. Both things can be true simultaneously, and we need a system that can distinguish between them. If this story resonated with you, if it opened your eyes to something you hadn't considered before, or if it just reminded you that truth matters, even when it's difficult to find and fight for, please leave a like on this video. It helps more people find these important stories, helps the algorithm show this to others who might need to hear it. And if you want to hear more real-life stories like this, stories of survival, justice, human resilience, and the power of truth, please subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Every subscriber helps build a community of people who value real stories and honest conversations about difficult topics. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it, someone who might be going through their own battle with false accusations, someone who's struggling with trust issues after betrayal, or someone who simply needs a reminder that truth does eventually prevail even when it seems impossible. Drop a comment below with your thoughts, your own experiences with betrayal or false accusations, or just to let me know you made it to the end of this long, difficult journey with me. Your comments and engagement mean everything and help create a supportive community. Thank you for listening, for believing in the power of truth, for being willing to hear a difficult story about a painful topic, and for being part of a community that values real stories and real justice over simple narratives. Until next time, stay strong, keep fighting for what's right, and remember that truth is worth fighting for no matter how long it takes or how difficult the battle becomes.